Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Lagos, there lived a woman named Ezinne. She was the epitome of success, a sharp-minded, determined businesswoman who had built an empire from the ground up. Her name was known far and wide, from the markets of Balogun to the high-rises of Victoria Island. Ezinne's shops were the go-to for the finest fabrics, and her hospitality businesses catered to the elite. She had wealth, influence, and a life many envied. But beyond her boardroom success, Ezinne was a mother of two, and her love for her children knew no bounds. Ezinne had grown up in the rural town of Enugu, where life was hard, and discipline was the order of the day. Her parents were strict, harsh even, never hesitating to use the rod to instill discipline in her and her siblings. Ezinne had hated it, the constant scolding, the lack of affection. The childhood memories of being chastised for the smallest mistakes, of the cold, stern faces of her parents, haunted her well into adulthood. So when she had children of her own, she swore they would never know the kind of suffering she endured. She vowed to give them everything she never had, to shield them from the harshness of the world. Her husband, Emeka, was a man of strong principles. He believed in discipline and teaching the children the value of hard work. He had grown up in a household where respect was earned, not given, and where every action had consequences. To him, there was a balance between love and discipline, a balance that was crucial in raising children to become responsible adults. But Ezinne, determined to break the cycle of harshness she grew up with, often clashed with him. She couldn't bear to see her children disciplined, to see them cry, so she often undermined Emeka's authority, brushing off his concerns and spoiling their children at every turn. Their son, Obinna, and daughter, Edeora, grew up with a silver spoon firmly in their mouths. If they wanted something, they got it. If they made a mistake, their mother would cover for them. Ezinne doted on them excessively, excusing their every fault. As the children grew older, Emeka became increasingly worried. He saw the warning signs, Obinna's growing arrogance, Adora's entitlement, but Ezinne dismissed his concerns, insisting that they were just finding themselves. As the years passed, the differences in their parenting styles caused a deep rift in the marriage. Emeka tried reasoning with Ezinne, warning her that the path she was leading the children down would only bring sorrow. But she refused to listen. Their arguments became more frequent, more heated, until one day, Emeka made a decision that would change everything. He left. Unable to bear watching his children spiral out of control, and feeling powerless to stop it, Emeka moved out, leaving Ezinne to her choices. Ezinne was heartbroken but resolute. She believed that Emeka's departure would only strengthen her bond with her children. She doubled down on her efforts to protect them from the world's harsh realities, continuing to shower them with money, gifts, and freedom. If they stayed out late, she made excuses for them. If they got into trouble, she used her influence to smooth things over. She was convinced that love meant shielding them from pain, even if it meant bending the rules. The first signs of trouble began to surface when Obinna, once a bright and ambitious boy, became lazy and unmotivated. His school reports showed a dramatic decline in performance, and his teachers often complained about his lack of interest and disruptive behavior. Ezinne, however, would brush it off, insisting that Obinna was simply going through a phase. She refused to acknowledge the growing distance between her and her son, the way he would shrug off her attempts to engage him in conversation, choosing instead to lock himself in his room for hours on end. Edeora, on the other hand, grew more rebellious with each passing day. She had always been a lively, spirited girl, but as she entered her teenage years, that spirit turned into defiance. Edeora became obsessed with nightlife and the attention of men, sneaking out at night to attend parties and clubs. She started coming home in the early hours of the morning, often intoxicated and with stories that Ezinne chose not to question too deeply. The mother-daughter bond that had once been so strong began to fray as Edeora pushed boundaries further and further. Emeka, now living with his new wife and their young children, watched from a distance as the situation with his older children worsened. He had remarried, knowing that the children with Ezinne would not turn out well because of her approach to parenting. His new wife, a quiet and understanding woman, gave him the stability he had longed for. They had 2 children together, and Emeka was determined to raise them differently. But despite his new life, he couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow for Obinna and Edeora. He often wondered if there was anything he could have done to change the course of their lives. Back in Lagos, Ezinne's world was slowly unraveling. The once glamorous life she had built was overshadowed by the growing chaos in her household. She tried to maintain the appearance of success and happiness, but the cracks were beginning to show. Her business, which had once been her pride and joy, became a burden as she struggled to balance her responsibilities with the mounting troubles at home. The first major incident that shook Ezinne to her core happened when Obinna, barely 18, was caught stealing from a local electronics store. It was a small theft, just a few gadgets, but the implications were huge. The police were called, and Obinna was taken to the station. Ezinne, as always, swooped in to save him, using her connections to prevent him from facing any real consequences. She paid off the shop owner and convinced the police to let him go with a warning. But instead of learning from the experience, Obinna became even more brazen, convinced that his mother's influence could shield him from anything. The next incident was even more devastating. Edeora, who had just turned 19, had gotten involved with a group of friends known for their wild lifestyles. One night, after a particularly wild party, Edeora got into a car accident while driving under the influence. The car was a wreck, and Edeora was seriously injured. The other driver, an elderly man, was in critical condition. The incident was all over the news, and the once proud mother was forced to pay an enormous sum in damages to keep Edeora out of jail. But the accident left Edeora with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the night her life almost ended. Ezinne's world was falling apart, and she knew it. But she still refused to accept that her way of raising her children had been wrong. She clung to the belief that she had done the best she could, that her love for them had been enough. But deep down, the doubts were beginning to creep in. The distance between her and her children grew wider with each passing day. Obinna and Edeora barely spoke to her, and when they did, it was with anger and resentment. They blamed her for everything that had gone wrong in their lives, and Ezinne, though heartbroken, couldn't find the strength to argue. Then came the night that would forever change her life. It was a rainy evening, and Ezinne was at home waiting for her children. They had gone out, as usual, promising to be back before midnight. But as the hours ticked by and the rain continued to pour, Ezinne's worry grew. She called their phones, but there was no answer. She began to pace the living room, fear gnawing at her heart. Then, just after 2 a.m., the door burst open. Obinna and Edeora stumbled in, soaked to the bone, reeking of alcohol. Their clothes were torn, and Edeora had a cut on her forehead. Ezinne rushed to them, her heart pounding. What happened? She cried, reaching out to touch Edeora's wound. But instead of answers, she was met with anger. "Leave us alone, Mom." Obinna snapped, pushing her hand away. Edeora slumped onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "They were going to kill us," Edeora sobbed, clutching her brother's arm. "Those men, they. Ezinne's blood ran cold. "What men? What happened?" Obinna, his eyes wild, looked at his mother with a mixture of anger and fear. "It's your fault, Mom. You made us like this. If you hadn't, his voice broke, and he turned away, unable to finish. Ezinne was frozen in place, her mind racing. She had never seen her children like this, so scared, so broken. And for the first time, the full weight of her choices began to sink in. Through broken words and sobs, she learned the truth. That night, Obinna and Edeora had gone to a notorious club in a dangerous part of town. There, they had gotten into a confrontation with a group of men who weren't like the pampered kids they usually hung out with. These men were dangerous, and they didn't take kindly to being disrespected. The situation escalated quickly, and before Obinna and Edeora knew it, they were being dragged outside, beaten, and threatened. They had only escaped because a passerby had intervened, scaring the men off long enough for them to run. Ezinne's heart shattered as she listened to their story. How had it come to this? How had her love for her children led them to such a dark place? As she sat there, holding her trembling daughter, the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This was her doing. She had failed them, not by being too harsh, but by being too lenient. By spoiling them, by protecting them from the world, she had made them vulnerable to it. But the worst was yet to come. A few days later, Ezinne was at work, trying to focus on a meeting with a potential investor when her phone rang. It was the police. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered, and the voice on the other end delivered the news that would forever haunt her. Edeora was dead. She had gone out again the night before, against Ezinne's wishes, to meet some friends. But this time, she hadn't come home. The police found her body in an alley behind a nightclub. She had been attacked, beaten to death by the same men who had threatened them days before. Ezinne's world came crashing down. The pain was unbearable, the guilt overwhelming. She had lost her daughter, her precious Edeora, because she hadn't been strong enough to say no, to set boundaries, to protect her from the very things she thought she was shielding her from. Obinna was devastated, blaming himself for not protecting his sister. He spiraled into a deep depression, his reckless behavior worsening as he tried to drown his grief in alcohol and drugs. Ezinne tried to reach him, to pull him back from the edge, but it was too late. The boy she had once held in her arms was gone, replaced by a broken man who wanted nothing to do with her. And as for Ezinne, she was left with nothing but her regrets. Her business empire, once her pride and joy, became meaningless. She spent her days in a haze of grief, replaying every decision she had made, every time she had chosen to spoil her children instead of guiding them. One night, unable to bear the pain any longer, Ezinne drove to the spot where Edeora had died. She sat there in the dark, the cold wind whipping around her, and finally allowed herself to cry. She wept for her daughter, for her son, for her marriage, and for the life she had ruined with her own hands. But as the tears flowed, a strange sense of clarity came over her. This was her punishment, her penance for the mistakes she had made. And though it was too late to save Edeora, maybe, just maybe, she could still save Obinna. With renewed determination, Ezinne threw herself into helping her son. She took him to rehab, stayed by his side through every painful step of recovery, and slowly, over time, began to rebuild their shattered relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks along the way, but Ezinne refused to give up. She couldn't bring back Edeora, but she could try to save what was left of her family. But even as she focused on Obinna's recovery, the weight of her guilt never left her. Every day, she was haunted by memories of Edeora, of the laughter they had shared, the dreams she had once had for her daughter. And every day, she was reminded of how she had failed to protect her, how her love had blinded her to the dangers that surrounded them. Months passed, and Obinna's condition began to improve. He started attending therapy, slowly opening up about his feelings, his guilt, and his pain. He re-enrolled in school, determined to make something of his life, to honor his sister's memory by becoming the man she would have been proud of. Ezinne watched him with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that this was what she had always wanted for her children, but realizing too late the cost it had come at. But just as things were beginning to look up, tragedy struck once more. One evening, as Ezinne was driving Obinna home from a therapy session, they were involved in a terrible car accident. Another driver, speeding and drunk, crashed into their car at an intersection. The impact was devastating, and both Ezinne and Obinna were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Obinna survived, though he was left with permanent injuries that would change his life forever. But Ezinne was not so fortunate. She died in the hospital, her body too broken to recover from the trauma of the crash. In her final moments, as she lay in the hospital bed, Ezinne thought of her children. She thought of Edeora, of the dreams she had had for her, and of Obinna, who was finally finding his way after so much pain. She thought of Emeka, the husband she had lost, and the life they could have had if she had only listened. And in those final moments, she whispered a prayer for forgiveness, for peace, and for her children to find the happiness that had always eluded her. Ezinne's death was a devastating blow to Obinna, but it also became a turning point in his life. In the months and years that followed, he channeled his grief into his recovery, determined to live a life that would make his mother proud. He went on to finish his education, to build a career, and to start a family of his own. And though the pain of losing his mother and sister never truly left him, he found solace in the knowledge that they had loved him, even if that love had sometimes been misguided. As for Emeka, he mourned Ezinne's death, but he also found a sense of closure. He had loved her, despite their differences, and he had always wished the best for her. Her death brought back memories of the life they had once shared, of the hopes and dreams they had had for their children. And in the end, he found peace in knowing that she had tried, in her own way, to do what she thought was best. The story of Ezinne, Obinna, and Edeora is a reminder of the complexities of love, of the challenges of parenthood, and of the importance of finding balance in life. It is a tale of regret and redemption, of the consequences of our choices, and of the enduring power of love, even in the face of tragedy. And though Ezinne's life ended in sorrow, her legacy lived on in her son, in the lessons he learned, and in the love he carried with him for the rest of his days. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe, like and comment.